Stop. Before you watch another second of this video, I need you to think about the last argument you had. You were passionate. You were certain. You had all the right points lined up perfectly in your head. And yet, something felt off afterward. Like you'd won the battle but somehow lost something more important. That feeling. That's not guilt. That's not weakness. That's your subconscious trying to tell you something that society has been desperately hiding from you. Because here's the dark psychological truth that manipulators, narcissists, and the genuinely powerful already know, and they pray you never figure out. Every time you argue, you're handing them your power. And Friedrich Nietzsche, the most dangerous philosopher who ever lived, decoded exactly why this happens. What it reveals about your psychology. And how the truly powerful use this knowledge to silently dominate every room they enter. This is Silent Minds. And what you're about to learn will permanently change how you see every human interaction for the rest of your life. Here's something that dark psychology researchers have understood for decades, something that never gets taught in schools, never gets discussed in therapy, and never trends on social media because the people who benefit from your ignorance work very hard to keep it buried. Arguments are not about truth. They are about psychological control. Every single argument you've ever witnessed, whether it was a couple fighting in a restaurant, a political debate on television, or a comment war on YouTube, was never really about the topic on the surface. It was about something far more primal. Far more psychological. Far more disturbing. It was about dominance. About fear. About the desperate, animalistic need to feel like you exist and matter in the eyes of another person. Nietzsche identified this over a century ago with a concept he called ressentiment, and it is perhaps the most accurate psychological description of human weakness ever written. Ressentiment is not simply resentment. It's deeper and darker than that. It's the psychological condition of people who have no real internal power, so they build their entire identity by reacting against others. By defining themselves through opposition. By needing enemies to feel alive. Sound familiar? Look at social media. Look at political discourse. Look at the comment sections of any remotely controversial video. What you're witnessing isn't passionate debate. It's millions of psychologically fragile people screaming into the void, desperately trying to feel real through conflict. And here's the manipulation angle that dark psychology exposes completely. Narcissists and master manipulators know this about you. They know that if they can provoke you into arguing, they've already won. Because the moment you engage, you've handed them emotional control. You're now dancing to their rhythm. Reacting to their moves. Existing in their psychological frame, not your own. This is why genuinely powerful people, the ones who understand dark psychology at a deep level, almost never argue. Not because they're passive, but because they recognize the trap immediately. Let's go deeper. Because Nietzsche wasn't just making philosophical observations. He was performing psychological autopsies on human behavior, cutting through the surface to expose what's really operating underneath. His concept of the Overman, the Übermensch, wasn't a fantasy about physical superiority. It was a psychological blueprint. A precise description of what a human being looks like when they've completely dismantled their need for external validation. And the single most striking characteristic of Nietzsche's Overman: he cannot be provoked. Not because he's emotionally numb. Not because he doesn't have convictions. But because his psychological foundation is built entirely from the inside. His identity doesn't depend on your agreement. His self-worth doesn't require your validation. When you understand this at a deep level, you realize something disturbing about the people around you. Every person who needs to win an argument is revealing something deeply vulnerable about their psychology. They're showing you exactly where their insecurity lives. They're exposing the precise emotional wound that can be used to manipulate them, by anyone who knows how. Think about that from a dark psychology perspective. When someone argues aggressively with you, when they escalate, when they get personal, when they can't let it go, they are not demonstrating strength. They are handing you a psychological map of their weaknesses. Every hot button they reveal. Every topic that makes them spiral. Every insult that lands. Manipulators collect this information like currency. Meanwhile, the person who stays calm, who engages briefly and then withdraws, who refuses to be emotionally hijacked. That person leaves the interaction with more psychological power than they entered with. This is Nietzsche's dark insight translated into real-world power dynamics. And it's something that the genuinely powerful have understood for centuries. Here's where dark psychology gets genuinely unsettling. Narcissists, and more broadly, anyone who operates through psychological manipulation, have an almost instinctive understanding of what Nietzsche described philosophically. They know that your emotional reaction is their power source. This is why narcissists provoke arguments constantly. Why they say things specifically designed to trigger you. Why they push buttons with surgical precision and then sit back and watch you spiral. It's not random. It's not even always conscious. It's a deeply ingrained psychological strategy built on one core understanding: a person who is emotionally reactive is a person who can be controlled. When you argue with a narcissist, here's what's actually happening beneath the surface. You are proving to them that they have power over your emotional state. You are confirming their core psychological belief that they are significant enough to destabilize you. Every response you give, every point you make, every frustrated word that comes out of your mouth is feeding their psychological hunger. And this is exactly what Nietzsche was pointing at when he described ressentiment. Reactive people, people who define themselves through opposition and conflict, are psychologically dependent on their enemies. They need the fight to feel alive. They need the argument to feel real. This applies to narcissists. It applies to online trolls. It applies to that coworker who always has to have the last word. And if we're being completely honest, it applies to all of us in the moments when our ego is running the show instead of our intelligence. The dark psychology truth is brutal. You cannot win an argument with someone who feeds on conflict. The only winning move is to refuse to play. Now we get to the part that genuinely disturbs people who rely on psychological manipulation. Nietzsche believed that silence, strategic, deliberate, unshakable silence, is one of the most psychologically dominant moves a human being can make. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. Not the silence of fear or submission. The silence of someone who has assessed the situation, recognized the trap, and chosen not to step into it. Here's the dark psychology behind why this works. When you refuse to argue, when you stay completely calm while someone is trying to provoke a reaction, you are violating their psychological script. Their entire strategy depends on your engagement. Their power move requires your participation. And when you don't participate, watch what happens. They escalate. They get louder. They get more extreme. They start making claims that are increasingly disconnected from reality because they're panicking. Their psychological control mechanism has failed and they don't know how to operate without it. Meanwhile, every person observing this interaction is watching you remain calm and them unravel. And they're drawing very clear psychological conclusions about who actually has power in this dynamic. This is what Nietzsche meant when he described the Overman's relationship with conflict. Not avoidance. Not passivity. Strategic psychological withdrawal. The refusal to allow your emotional state to become someone else's tool. In dark psychology, this is sometimes called gray rock method, making yourself psychologically uninteresting to manipulators by removing the emotional reaction they're hunting for. But Nietzsche understood this principle a century before modern psychology gave it a name. Let's dismantle one of the biggest psychological myths that society has sold you. You've been taught that power means controlling others, winning debates, dominating conversations, being the loudest, most forceful presence in the room. This is exactly what Nietzsche spent his entire career proving wrong. His concept of will to power had nothing to do with controlling other people. It was about something far more difficult, far more demanding, far more psychologically sophisticated. Mastery over the self. And here's the dark psychology implication of this that most people completely miss. The person who needs to control others through arguments, manipulation, and dominance, that person has zero self-mastery. They are entirely dependent on external outcomes to regulate their internal psychological state. They feel powerful when they win. They feel worthless when they lose. Their entire emotional existence is outsourced to other people's responses. That is not power. That is psychological slavery dressed up as confidence. Real power, Nietzsche's will to power applied to human psychology, looks like this. A person who can be insulted and feel nothing shift inside them. Not because they're suppressing emotion, but because their identity is not located in other people's opinions. A person who can lose an argument and walk away genuinely unbothered, because they know that being wrong about something doesn't make them less valuable as a human being. A person who can observe someone trying to psychologically manipulate them, and simply choose not to engage, without any internal struggle, without any need to prove they saw through it. That kind of psychological freedom is genuinely terrifying to manipulators. Because they have no lever, no button, no trigger that works. And in dark psychology terms, a person who cannot be emotionally triggered is a person who cannot be controlled. Here's one of Nietzsche's darkest observations about human nature, and it maps perfectly onto modern psychological research about conformity, social pressure, and manipulation. He called it herd mentality. And it is the single most powerful psychological trap that keeps most people permanently weak. The herd is not just a metaphor. It's a precise psychological description of how most humans operate. Herd thinkers don't form opinions, they adopt them. They don't develop values, they inherit them. They don't think for themselves, they monitor the group and mirror whatever perspective seems safest, most accepted, most likely to keep them included. And arguments, particularly online arguments, are the herd's primary mechanism for enforcing conformity. When someone argues aggressively with you about your beliefs, what they're often really doing, psychologically, is trying to pull you back into the herd. To punish you for independent thought. To make the psychological cost of having a different perspective too high to maintain. This is why cancel culture works. This is why public shaming works. This is why online mobs are so psychologically devastating. It's not about truth. It's about herd enforcement. The psychological punishment of anyone who breaks from collective thinking. Nietzsche identified this dynamic as one of the most dangerous forces in human civilization. And dark psychology research consistently confirms his insight: social exclusion activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The psychological threat of being cast out of the group is literally experienced as physical danger by the human brain. Manipulators and narcissists exploit this constantly. They use social pressure, public humiliation, and tribal arguments to keep psychologically vulnerable people in line. The Overman, the psychologically sovereign individual, is the person who has done the terrifying internal work of becoming genuinely comfortable with disapproval. Who has broken the herd's psychological hold by choosing their own values over collective acceptance. This is not arrogance. This is not antisocial behavior. This is the hardest psychological work a human being can do. Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate, sounds like philosophy. But applied to dark psychology, it becomes one of the most powerful psychological weapons available to a human being. Here's what it means in practical terms. Most people experience conflict as something happening to them. Something threatening. Something that needs to be fought, escaped, or resolved as quickly as possible. This psychological posture makes them permanently vulnerable. Because conflict is inevitable. Provocations are constant. Attempts to manipulate, destabilize, and control you are a permanent feature of human social life. If your psychological strategy is to avoid all conflict, you will spend your entire life in a state of low-grade panic, because the conflict never stops coming. Amor fati flips this completely. Instead of experiencing a provocation as a threat, the psychologically sovereign person experiences it as information. As an opportunity. As a test that, when passed, leaves them stronger than before. The person who tries to trigger you. They just showed you where your untested psychological edges are. The argument you refuse to engage with. You just demonstrated, to yourself and everyone watching, that your emotional state is under your control, not theirs. The criticism that was designed to wound you. When it doesn't land, it destroys the psychological power of everyone who tries to use it. This is amor fati as a dark psychology tool. The transformation of every attack into evidence of your own psychological strength. And here's the deeply unsettling thing about people who operate this way. They become impossible to manipulate. Because nothing that happens to them feeds weakness. everything becomes fuel. Every conflict becomes proof. Every attempt to destabilize them becomes another layer of psychological armor. Everything we've covered is useless without application. So here are the precise psychological moves, rooted in Nietzsche's philosophy and validated by modern dark psychology research. The internal interrogation. The moment you feel the urge to argue, immediately ask, what is being threatened right now? Your ego? Your reputation? Your need to be seen as intelligent? Name it precisely. This single act of self-awareness breaks the automatic reactive pattern that manipulators depend on. Detach identity from opinion. Your opinions are not you. Your beliefs are not you. They are tools, subject to revision, expansion, and occasional disposal. When you fully internalize this, disagreement stops feeling like a personal attack. And when it stops feeling like an attack, you stop reacting like you're under threat. Strategic engagement. Not every conflict deserves your psychological energy. Before engaging, run a quick internal calculation. Does this interaction move me toward my goals or away from them? Most arguments fail this test immediately. The ones that pass deserve your full, calm, deliberate attention, not your reactive emotion. Embody rather than argue. This is Nietzsche's most powerful practical insight. Stop defending your values. Start demonstrating them. Build. Create. Achieve. When your results speak with undeniable clarity, the need to argue about your worth evaporates completely. Here's the darkest truth of everything we've covered today. The people who argue the loudest, the ones who can never let it go, who always need the last word, who spiral when challenged, they are not your enemies. They are mirrors. Every aggressive arguer you've ever encountered was showing you a version of psychological weakness that lives, in some form, inside all of us. The difference between them and the person Nietzsche was describing is not intelligence. It's not talent. It's not even strength. It's awareness. The moment you truly understand that your emotional reaction is someone else's psychological weapon, everything changes. You stop being a target. You stop being controllable. You stop being predictable. And you start becoming something that genuinely disturbs the manipulators, the narcissists, and the psychologically weak people in your life. Someone they cannot read, cannot provoke, cannot control. That silence you'll carry, that calm you'll project. It won't feel like weakness to anyone who encounters it. It will feel like the most terrifying kind of power they've ever been in the room with. This is Silent Minds. Subscribe, because next video, we go somewhere even darker. And most people will not be ready. The question is, are you?